Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm AJ Langley, and this week's episode is a little bit different. Rather than one special guest, today we have two. I am joined by Doctors Laura Varnam and Laura Kalas. Laura Varnam is a lecturer in Old and Middle English Literature at University College, Oxford, and her first book, The Church as Sacred Space in Middle English Literature and Culture, was published by Manchester University Press in 2018. Laura Kalas is Senior Lecturer in Medieval Literature at Swansea University. Her book, Margery Kempe's Spiritual Medicine, Suffering, Transformation, and the Life Course, was published in 2020, and her revealing of the annotated recipe from the back of the Book of Margery Kempe has been featured in The Guardian and the BBC History magazine. Today, they are joining me both as the mysticism scholars that they are, and as the co-editors of the forthcoming critical volume, Encountering the Book of Margery Kempe, out this month, and co-founders of the Margery Kempe Society. So it is no surprise that they are here to speak about Margery Kempe. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you for having us. It's really, really great to be invited.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
As always, before we start talking about our mystic, let's talk a little bit more about you. Let's start with Laura Varnam. Can you tell me how you first became interested in mysticism as a field of study?
Thank you. So for me, it was when I was on my MA course at Leeds, and I was lucky enough to audit an undergraduate module that focused on medieval women's visionary writing, including Margery Kempe and Julian of Norwich, but particularly situating them in a European context. This was with a wonderful scholar at Leeds, Mary Swan, who's sadly no longer with us. And she very kindly invited me to join her for this particular course. And it was really valuable to me because it made me think immediately about Margery Kempe and Julian of Norwich in a European context. So not just as English mystics, but alongside Hildegard of Bingen, Angela of Foligno, and so on. So to think about them as very much part of a tradition rather than in isolation. And it also helped me think about them in a teaching context, because I was there not only to learn about these mystics, but to think about how Mary was teaching them, how she was introducing them to students. And that was really fantastic. So it helped me to really think about how they speak to us now as students, as academics, and particularly how they speak to us as women, which is something I'm very interested in.
Same here. And Laura Kalas, how did you come to find yourself studying mysticism?
Yes, thanks. My trajectory, I suppose, is actually quite similar to Laura's in many ways. I also developed an interest during my MA studies. I was following an MA in medieval studies at the University of Kent, and I also undertook a module in medieval visionary literature with a particular focus on Margery Kempe and Julian of Norwich, just as Laura was saying with her own. And so that's where my interest got started on those women in particular. But beyond that, I think in terms of mysticism, I've always had a particular interest in sort of human cognition and the ways in which we sort of process and understand our own individual experiences. And I've also got an interest in medical humanities, and this has sort of permeated my work more recently. But I'm particularly interested in the ways in which we can use medical discourses to inform our understanding of these sorts of phenomena, particularly the medical discourses of the Middle Ages, I should add, rather than attempting any anachronistic retrospective diagnoses. So I'm quite interested in the way in which people in the Middle Ages understood the interrelation of physical and psychological processes to be quite fluid, more so than in the modern day, although I think actually we're coming a little bit back to that nowadays. And then reading the lives of these medieval women in these visionary accounts lends itself so well to thinking through those sorts of questions, I think. They give us these really intimate encounters with these very interesting phenomenological experiences, and so I think that's what draws me to thinking about mysticism.
I love that you both found the text in very similar ways, but I'm wondering, what were your first impressions of Margery and her work?
So because of the context in which I met Margery within this group of other European visionary women, I didn't come upon her thinking, oh gosh, she's quite strange, or oh, this is a little bit extreme. I felt that there were these really interesting cross connections, that there was this real intensity about her experience, and that I could understand that through thinking about the other kinds of devotional practices that were going on at the same time. One of the things that I learned about on my MA and was really fascinated by was thinking about the Beguine women. So I've always been fascinated by lay devotional experience and how that can be supported within networks of female mystics. So I was starting to think about Margery in that context already, how she makes different connections with the women that she knows. other mystics, both textually and the ones that she meets, like Julian of Norwich, but also in terms of other ordinary women that she meets. And I've written a little bit about Margery's female networks. The other thing I've always been really interested in with Margery is how her mystical and devotional experiences play out in her world. The sort of material culture of Margery's book, the spaces and places that she visits and she goes to. And quite early on, I went on holiday to King's Lynn and did a bit of a Margery Kempe pilgrimage. I went to St Margaret's Church and have then obviously gone on to write quite a lot about her experience there. So there's very much been a on-the-ground kind of feeling to my thinking about Margery that's been there from the get-go.
I have also made that particular pilgrimage. I remember when I was there, I was wishing that they actually sold Margery Kempe pilgrim badges so that those of us who study her would get a little memento of having made the trip. Laura, what were your first impressions of Margery?
My first impressions of Margery are quite similar to Laura's in many ways. I've also done the Margery Kempe pilgrimage to King's Lynn, which was really memorable, although I did that later on, actually, in the last few years rather than way back during my MA studies. But I can remember encountering Margery as this sort of simultaneously alien figure, but also strangely familiar in terms of these sort of comings and goings that are described in the book. And it's sort of quite fast paced at times. And she visits somebody and then she visits somebody else and she travels around the country. And, you know, she has these conversations with people and she describes so much of her emotional response to things and so much of the conflict and those sorts of scornful responses that she has directed at her. And so it was that sort of tension between the very strange and the very familiar that I really engaged with. And this verisimilitude, I suppose, that we get in the book, it just feels so lifelike a lot of the time. And while a lot of Kempe's behaviours, particularly in church, with obviously her notorious cryings and weepings and collapsings, they seem so distant from us in many ways now. But in actual fact, there's so much that feels very lifelike about the book. And I think I just instantly engaged with it from that point of view because it felt like it was kind of inviting me in as a reader to sort of almost be there and participate in these kinds of events. And so I really enjoyed that sense of sort of realness, I suppose, in the text.
I always think it's interesting because her behaviors seem very strange to a modern reader, but I think that's because they're picturing them happening in a church. If you picture her at a concert of the Beatles in their heyday, the screaming and crying and throwing herself on the floor makes total sense.
Absolutely. Various people have written on this, haven't they? You know, Alicia Spencer Hall and various other scholars have kind of written quite recently on these sort of resonances with modern day sort of fandom. And absolutely, there's so much of it actually that can resonate with modern day culture. And so, you know, when you start thinking through those sorts of questions, perhaps these experiences and these events aren't as alien as we might first think.
Absolutely. And I think there is something to be said about modern, perhaps what we might think of as evangelical Christianity, a very intense kind of religious experience where participants in those kinds of church rituals, you know, are really involved in it, and there's music and there's a great deal of enthusiasm. I think, you know, Margery would feel quite at home in that kind of space. I have a memory, I think Laura and I have talked about this before, and I'm not sure now whether it's my memory or Laura's memory. We are the Margery Kempe Lauras and we've become sort of symbiotically interchangeable. But I have a memory, I think, of being in St Margaret's and there being a woman there who was weeping. So this is something that we do in some ways experience and can still access in the modern day, but perhaps in a slightly different arena. But I think it is a question that's quite important when thinking about teaching Margery Kempe. When I first started teaching her, she often popped up after I'd taught Chaucer, Dream Vision poetry, the Gawain poet, and then suddenly Margery Kempe. And students were kind of, oh, right, I'm not really sure what my signposts are here. What's the scaffolding? What's the framework? How am I meant to understand all of this, you know, incredible material, but that, as Laura says, you sort of feel like you've been kind of hit by a bus. It all comes at you so fast. So after a couple of years, I started having a week before I taught the book where I introduced the students to a range of different kinds of religious and devotional experiences, the role of the church, how medieval women might engage with imagery, reading Middle English lyrics, looking at incredible manuscript illuminations, and then you bring Margery and Julian into the mix, and then students can say, okay, yeah, I can see where she's coming from out of this kind of environment.
Exactly. And I mean, she's seeing and speaking to God. She's having an intimate experience of divinity. When you put it in that lens, of course she's overwhelmed and having really big feelings and enormous reactions. It must be a complete and total shock to the system. Now, avid listeners of the podcast will know that we've done an episode on Margery Kempe before, but just in case it is their first introduction, can you tell us a little bit about Margery?
Absolutely. So I'll just run through some dates and essential info following on from Anat's wonderful podcast previously on Margery. But yes, Margery, she's born in 1373 in what is now known as King's Lynn in Norfolk, then known as Bishop's Lynn. And she's born into a prosperous merchant family of whom she is incredibly proud, particularly in her earlier years. Her father is John Brunham. He's mayor of Bishop's Lynn twice. He also holds various other civic roles during his lifetime. And when she marries her husband, John Kempe, when she's around 20 years old, in circa 1393, she mentions in the book that she feels that this is a marriage that's slightly below her social status, which in a sense is actually a rather nice detail because it suggests to us that she actually married John Kempe out of love rather than any sort of social reason. And we think she dies sometime after about 1440. There's no actual record of her death. There's no record of a burial site. We do know that there was an excavation of a charnel house adjacent to her parish church, St Margaret's Church in King's Lynn. This is something that I write about in my book. But there is no evidence that she's buried in there. We know nothing really about what happened to her. The last record that we have of her is in the 1439 account rolls of the Holy Trinity Guild in King's Lynn, where she had become a full member by that time and is recorded in those account rolls as having made her final payment. So this is a very prestigious guild in Lynn and is very much indicative of her status in the town by that point as a woman of some holy prestige. In terms of the book itself, there's a complicated genesis to this book, as I'm sure all of the listeners will already know. But the book undergoes several iterations, really. She decides a little bit later in life, after some deliberation, that she does finally want to dictate the story of her life to a scribe. And she first does this in around 1432, and she's about 60 years old. And scholars have, up until sort of quite recently, assumed that this was probably her adult son, who had been living in Germany. But more recent thought is that actually that might not be completely the case. The adult son is, in fact, only over in England for about a month until he unfortunately dies. But one of the reasons for that speculation has been the fact that this very first iteration of the book, of book one as we now know it, was written in this very difficult hybrid of English and German. And so when the first scribe sadly dies and Margery Kempe is left with the problem of having to find somebody else to take up the task of recording her life in this way, she struggles to find somebody to do this. Finally, after a bit of persuasion and a little bit of miraculous input, she finally finds a priest who's suddenly able to read this very difficult hybrid handwriting. And so he begins to rewrite book one in about 1436. And then a couple of years later, we get book two dictated, and this happens in about 1438. Book two is a very different part of the book. It has a very different texture and feel to it, in the sense that many people have suggested that it's more of a travel log, really, a record of her very late pilgrimages in her 60s, a record of a sort of holy woman on her final journeys, both geographically and spiritually. And I've sort of thought through those ideas a little bit more in a piece that I've written for the volume that Laura and I are editing, which we'll talk about later. But it's an interesting component of the book overall. So book two was begun, as I said, in 1438. And then we don't hear very much until 1501, when Wynkyn de Worde prints a redaction of some of the text in an early print edition called A Short Treatise of Contemplation, taught by our Lord Jesus Christ, taken out of the book of Margery Kempe of Lynn. And then that's followed in 1521 by some extracts that Henry Pepwell then decides to print in a text named A Very Devout Treatise. And this is a collection of devotional works which Margery Kempe therefore features within, including other visionaries like Catherine of Siena. So by that point, the very fact that extracts from Margery's book are appearing in this particular collection tells us something about the way in which she was beginning to be regarded more widely as a figure of devotional renown.
Exactly. To be placed alongside other prominent mystical women in such a way definitely speaks to a contemporary appreciation of her and her work. So, Laura, can you tell us a little bit more about the content of her book?
Yes, so she talks in the proem about it being a book of her feelings and revelations, and so her visions and her spiritual, emotional feelings and experiences. In the proem, it's introduced as a short treatise and a comfortable for sinful wretches. It's a work that is, for our example and instruction, if lack of charity be not our hindrance. So she's quite interested in creating a charitable readership that's going to respond positively to the things that she and her scribes collaboratively are telling us. When I introduce the book to students, I tend to focus on 3 elements that I think are really crucial to think about. One is the role of dialogue in the book. Margery spends a lot of time talking. She's chatting to Christ. She's talking and debating with her critics. She's talking with her supporters. She uses dialogue as a way of creating these supportive networks. She's, of course, also talking to her scribes and narrating her life story and thinking it through verbally before, as Laura says, it becomes the sort of book on the page as we now have it. So the book is fundamentally collaborative. I think that's the first important point. The second is thinking a bit about space and place and geography in the book, is to think about her travels. I've written about Margery's deep attachment to St Margaret's Parish Church in King's Lynn. It's a really crucial space as the sort of home of her religious experiences. But the book of Margery Kempe is like The Hobbit. It's a there and back again kind of a book. But she does the there and back again many, many, many times. So she's travelling around England. It's a kind of who's who of the 15th century church in England, and whether that's going to Norwich and meeting Julian, or meeting the Archbishop of Canterbury, or going on pilgrimages to all the important sites in England. But of course, she's also going on a huge number of pilgrimages in Europe and to the Holy Land. So this is a book that's about travelling as a mode of mystical and devotional experience. Of course, she has her first cry that she cries in contemplation when she's at Calvary in the Holy Land, and she brings those tears back with her to King's Lynn. So travel is part of the mode of her personal expression. The third element, so dialogue, travel and geography, and then the other thing that I like to think about is that Margery's book, it's a record of her personal development in all sorts of ways. So after her initial conversion, after her breakdown, she then is developing herself internally as a mystic through all these conversations she's having, the visions she's experiencing. There's a kind of public development, her attempt to establish herself repeatedly as an authoritative and recognisable holy woman. Laura and I have been talking a little bit recently about those moments at which Margery is recognised both positively and negatively when she's out and about. She's also developing her own identity as a medieval woman. She's, of course, married with 14 children. She's from this prominent family in King's Lynn, as Laura said. And she's negotiating those roles, or renegotiating those roles, within a mystical and devotional context. So I think those are the sort of 3 key areas that I would flag up to someone who might be encountering the book for the first time.
One of the things you both bring up then is that Margery seems like more of a real person than some other mystics do, in that she's not outlining an intensive theological schema or going to great pains to highlight the steps that one must take in order to achieve a similar kind of union with the divine, but instead is just relating her own experiences, the conversations she has with Christ, the conversations she has with the people around her that she interacts with, and her own travels on pilgrimage.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm so fascinated by the sort of material culture of the book. So whether it's seeing a pietà in a Norwich church, being given back the keys to the buttery when she recovers at the beginning of the book, the different kinds of clothing that she wears at various points. It's the things and the places that really give us this sense of texture, and that we can put ourselves into those visions and into those experiences, just as Margery herself does following Nicholas Love's Meditations on the Life of Christ, inserting herself into the Passion scene, we can insert ourselves into Margery's world. And it's really not a leap to do that. As Laura said, she really invites us in. She kind of drags us in. We can't help but be there with her because of these amazing details.
I remember the first time I read about her getting the keys back to the buttery, and I just thought, oh, so postpartum, she couldn't be trusted because she ate too much butter. I can relate to that.
That's brilliant. I think that's really interesting. I mean, yes, the buttery episode is also quite crucial, isn't it, from the very beginning of the book? That postpartum distress that she experiences at the very start is a sort of turning point, really, in terms of her spiritual development. But I just wanted to pick up on what Laura was saying there about the way in which Margery really invites us into the book in that way, and what you were saying also, AJ, about the sort of limited interpretation that Margery offers us of her visionary experiences and of these mystical moments in the text. And I think that's one of the things that appeals to me about this book, is that it's quite democratic in the sense that we're allowed as readers to sort of reflect on that ourselves. It's very different, obviously, to something like Julian of Norwich's Revelations, where the whole point of the long text is to offer that very detailed, that very developed reflection and interpretation of her own visions and what she has come to understand that they mean in this very complex but incredibly wonderful and individual vernacular theology. And we just don't get that in Margery's book. Instead, she seems to prioritise emotion and sort of instinctive human response to these experiences. And I think that is also perhaps one of the reasons why she appeals so much to students when we're teaching her, is that there is this opportunity for us to fill in those gaps, perhaps, and to think, well, what does this mean then? What did Margery think that these experiences meant? And what do we think they meant? I think that sort of capaciousness about the book is something that really draws a lot of people towards it.
Speaking of things that draw people to this text, and in this case, what keeps them interested, I'm wondering, as people who have read this text, I assume multitudes of times, is there a moment or passage from the text that really sticks out in your mind as one of your favorites?
Gosh, a favourite moment in the book of Margery Kempe. How long have you got? All of it. Let's read it all out now. No, seriously. The moment that I'd like to talk about is, in fact, it's a chapter 85 in the book. And this is partly because it's something that I'm interested in at the moment. So this chapter is most well known to readers of the book as the moment when Margery has a dream vision when an angel points out her name in the Book of Life. This is a really important moment of authorization for Margery. Now, this whole chapter is what I think of as the dream vision chapter. It collects together a number of dream visions that Margery Kempe has while she's in church, certainly in St. Margaret's Church for one of the moments, in other places too. The fact that she links these dream visions together. She talks about being suddenly in a manner of sleep. She talks about her eyelids closing. She's gathered together these dream vision moments within this one chapter, which makes me think they sit slightly separately to some of the other visions that she has, or at least she sees them as a particular category of vision. So I've partly been thinking a bit about what the dream vision form might afford to Margery. So I'm interested in this moment in terms of what it might be able to start to tell us about Margery's organisation of her experiences within the book. I wanted to mention two particular visions in this chapter for what they tell us about both her mystical experience and her way of describing it. One is the moment when she falls asleep and she sees our Lord standing right up over her, so near that he thought she took his toes in her hand and felt them, and to her feeling it were as it had been very flesh and bone. So it's the toe fondling moment, which I find absolutely adorable and seems very characteristic of Margery. It's such a sweet little moment. But it's what she says afterwards that I think is particularly interesting. What we were just saying about the fact that there isn't always a great deal of developed interpretation of the visions. We get them, but she doesn't necessarily unpack them in the way that perhaps Julian might. Immediately after this, she says, and then she thanked God of all, for through these ghostly sights her affection was all drawn into the manhood of Christ and into the mind of his passion, unto that time that it pleased our Lord to give her understanding of his incomprehensible Godhead. So she's thinking there about this movement from a fascination and attachment to the manhood of Christ, which we see earlier on in the book when she's in Rome and she's crying over the sights of babies and young men, and she's invited to marry the Godhead, and she's really not very keen at first. She's kind of, can I just stick with Christ the Son? I'm cool with that kind of devotional experience. And so in this chapter, it mentions that this manner of visions and feelings she had soon after her conversion, and particularly when she keeps to the church both forenoon and afternoon. This is when Margery's spending a lot of time in the church. St. Margaret's and other churches become her sort of second home. So I think that's an interesting moment for thinking about her spiritual progress in the book. And then there's another vision in this same chapter, in chapter 85, where she falls asleep in the choir, and she sees with her ghostly eye our Lord's body lying before her, and his head, as she'd thought, fast by her with his blessed face upwards, the seemliest man that ever might be seen or thought. And then came one with a basilard knife, with some kind of dagger, to her sight, and cut that precious body all unlong in the breast. And she wept wonder sore, having more mind, pity, and compassion of the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ than she had before. This is a really extraordinary moment. It's very dramatic. It's very violent. It's intimate. Christ's head is near to her head. And then someone appears and slices Christ's breast. And this moment doesn't appear to have any analogues or sources. It's not something that I've come across elsewhere. If any listeners have, please get in touch. It's also been crossed out by the red ink annotator. One of the 4 annotators in Margery's book has crossed it out for some reason. And it's a surprise. Every time I think that Margery's book can't surprise me, it does. And this is one of those moments. There's something really interesting going on there. So it's an episode that I'm working on and thinking about. I just thought it would be fun to talk about it today.
So what we've learned is you're interested in toe fondling and extreme violence.
Basically, yes. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Oh, that's brilliant. I don't know how to follow that, actually. What do I say now? Laura's stolen the show.
Sorry about that.
I can't really beat toe fondling. Interestingly, the example that I've chosen is from the very next chapter, from chapter 86. And that in itself immediately struck me when Laura and I were talking about, which bit are you going to choose? And I thought, well, actually, the example that I'm particularly interested in is very, very close in terms of its proximity to those wonderful moments that Laura was just talking about so evocatively. And so I also think there's something interesting going on here in terms of the structure of the book. Now, obviously, this is something we've got to tread very carefully with, because we are told in the proem to the book that this book is not written in the order in which the events happened. This book is written as the events occur to Kempe as she's recounting them and remembering them. And so memory and memorialization is also another very interesting feature of the book. And, why is it that Margery does remember particular events and recall them at different moments? And why are they in the order that they are in? Is there something more that we can think about in terms of that kind of recollection? And so in some respects, I see the end of book 1 as being, if not structurally climactic in that very deliberate sense, then certainly climactic in that memorialized sense, that she is for some reason remembering these particular events later on as if they are bringing her to the end of some sort of spiritual journey, or at least some spiritual sort of reportage. And so really what I wanted to think about in chapter 86 is connected to the surrogacy hermeneutic that I have written about and see as being a particularly central motif in the text, particularly from that point of middle age where Margery relinquishes her reproductive capacities after she takes the vow of chastity with her husband John. And so I've been thinking about this in terms of that sort of elected post-reproductive state, but then obviously that moves into a biological post-reproductive state after menopause. And so I'm quite interested in thinking about the ways in which Kempe uses her physiology, her reproductive or post-reproductive body to sort of harness certain experiences or certain prior capabilities that she can utilise, therefore, in a different way as she develops in her spiritual maturity. And there are several substitutional operations that I think happen throughout the book, which she does use for this kind of edification. And in this chapter, several of these are described to us. She describes to us how she becomes a handmaid to the Virgin Mary whilst she's giving birth to Christ. She also describes at length the Christ doll that she encounters in Rome when she's on pilgrimage to Rome. And that becomes a very interesting episode in the book in itself, in that sense of this sort of female collective that are all surrounding this doll image of Christ and worshipping it and kissing it and embracing it and engaging with it in this very maternalized way. She also has a vision of the Virgin Mary swaddling Christ, which she describes as being the most gentle, tender act, which I think is a really nice moment. But the one that really strikes me in particular is the vision that she has of the Christ child suckling at the breast of the Virgin Mary within Margery Kempe's own soul. And I'll just read a short description of this from the book. So she's hearing the word of God at this point as she's having this visionary encounter. And she's told by God, "For daughter, there is nothing you might do on earth that might better please me than to allow me to speak to you in your soul, as then you understand my will and I understand your will. And also, daughter, you call for my mother to enter into your soul and to take me in her arms and to lay me on her breasts and give me suck." I think there are several interesting things going on here, not least in the sense that God tells Margery Kempe that he is living and breathing within her soul, that she has this internalized divine presence, which I think is quite remarkable. But beyond that, the idea that Christ is suckling on his own mother's breast within her soul sort of implicates Margery within that very important moment of Christ with his own mother, and all of those incumbent ideas to do with nurturing and sustenance and divine fertility and so on and so forth. And so it's really positioning Kempe there as a vessel of divine sustenance, and it becomes a sort of a soul womb, which I think is a really interesting facet to the book in terms of not only the generative qualities of the book that we see, I think, all the way through, but also the ways in which this event, like others, centralises Kempe as an indispensable agent, or a surrogate, as I like to see it, of Christ and the Virgin. And so you've got this really fascinating enclosure of the soul womb of Margery, which sort of transmogrifies these bodily borders, if you like, of motherhood and enables Kempe to achieve this sort of totalised possession of Christ within her soul womb. And of course, this is inspired by ubiquitous medieval iconography of Christ's maternity. These sorts of ideas are prevalent in medieval culture, originating with the Israelites being shown in the Old Testament to be conceived in God's womb, being fed by his milk, and this sort of maternal imagery that takes a lot of momentum from the 11th century via writings by theologians like Anselm of Canterbury and Bernard of Clairvaux, and then, of course, later Julian of Norwich. And so, yes, apart from that sort of generative, fertile motif that I think is happening in the book, there is also some sort of climactic dimension to what's going on here, that these events are being recollected quite late in these concluding pages of book one. And so really, I think that visions like this are sort of testament to the way in which Kempe does blend her life lived with these spiritual and devotional images. You know, we know she's a mother, we know she's given birth to 14 children. She's likely to have fed babies herself. She's also likely to have employed wet nurses, which is something else that I write about in my book. And so she's familiar with all of these domestic and maternal operations just as much as these devotional ones as well. And so it's this idea of participation as well, I think, that Christ and his mother can be transferred within Kempe, but also that idea that it therefore becomes accessible to her readers, and they also might be able to think about the ways in which they can access those self-same spiritual experiences themselves. So yes, it's not toe fondling, but it's the best I could do.
It's a great moment, and it makes me think of those Virgin Mary statues that open up to reveal the Throne of Mercy inside, and effectively what we've got then is Margery Kempe opening up with the Virgin Mary and with Christ inside, almost as a kind of double nesting doll. You know, and it's exactly that thing that Margery is opening herself up to us, to Christ, to Mary, and we're coming inside. It's a fantastic moment.
Okay, so in addition to Margery Kempe pilgrimage badges that you can get when you make that trip to King's Lynn, I also now need a Margery Kempe nesting doll. Can someone please make that for me? I need it to exist in the world. Please just let me know. That would be great.
It's the Team Margery merchandise we want to see in the world.
We need more mysticism merchandise. We may not be the broadest audience, but we are a passionate minority. Speaking of mysticism things that we want to see in the world, let's move on now to talk about your new book, Encountering the Book of Margery Kempe, coming out this month with Manchester University Press. Can you tell us a little bit about the volume?
Absolutely, yes. Laura and I are really excited to see this come to fruition. It's been a long time in the making, and we're really excited about it and very proud of it as well. And ostensibly, it's a new volume of essays which is seeking to offer a response to Margery Kempe and to her book in the 21st century. So it's filling a gap, first of all, in terms of the fact that the last collection of essays was 2004. So really we wanted to move things on and think about where scholarship of the book has taken us now and where it might indeed take us in the future. And so, as the title of the book might indicate, the volume is focused on this notion of encounter as a central principle. And we were particularly drawn to this idea of an encounter because of its inherent flexibility. You know, the fact that it can signify multiple things at once: physical, metaphorical, casual or accidental meetings, oppositions, disputes. It can be used in the noun or the verb form. It can exist in real time and place, but it also can exist in and between texts, across time and space, across history, across cultures. And so what we really wanted to do was orient the volume around a particular idea that allowed for a rich variety of approaches to the book in the 21st century, approaches that aren't limiting, approaches that can invite multiple and sometimes even perhaps discordant approaches to the text. And this seemed to us to be appropriate in the sense that the book itself really does resist categorization. It's hard to pin down what this book is. You know, what is the book? What is it for? Who is it for? You know, Laura was touching on the very collaborative existence of the book from the very beginning, and the fact that this is something that is an unruly text. It's something that is a capacious text. And so what we wanted to do was allow for multiple ways of approaching it and seeing that kind of capaciousness as an opportunity to think more widely, to think more courageously, if you like, about how we might think about Margery and her book. And so one of the examples that we use at the very beginning of our introduction to sort of illustrate this rationale behind the volume is what we have affectionately coined as pike-gate, which is the very famous episode in the book where Margery Kempe finds herself at a dinner party in London with some very worthy folk. And all of a sudden she realises that she's actually being talked about, and she realises that the people that are talking about her don't actually realise that she is in the room and at the table. And the guests are ridiculing this woman from Norfolk who apparently refuses to eat plain herring because she much favours fine pike. And so what's really fascinating, we think, about that episode is that Margery suddenly encounters her own mythological construction right before her very eyes. She's encountering her own public reputation as it's being made in real time in front of her eyes. So she's being ventriloquized, she's being ridiculed, she's being reconstructed, she's being fictionalized right then and there. And it's that sort of mythology of Margery that she encounters at that particular moment that causes her to actually be brave enough to stand up and identify herself and lay claim to her person. And we just find this a really interesting way of thinking about another type of encounter, an encounter that we find within the book. And, you know, we think about this in terms of sort of Foucauldian terms, in this idea of being simultaneously represented and contested and inverted. But she's also forced to confront her own image at that moment, just like Foucault's mirror. She's sort of existing outside herself and looking on at herself, but then from that point returns back to herself and to her own identity. So really it's that kind of slipperiness of construction and also self-construction and self-fashioning, which we find quite interesting. This slipperiness of who is Margery Kempe? Who do we deem her to be as readers, particularly in the 21st century? And also, what might our own encounters with the book mean now? So that's really the premise, if you like, the sort of rationale behind the volume. I think Laura's going to talk a little bit about how the volume is actually structured and laid out.
Thanks, Laura. I think one of the things that's really fascinating about that pike-gate episode is that sort of sense of doubling, of encountering your mirror self in a way that speaks to our relationship. We are the Margery Kempe Lauras, and we sort of bounce ideas off each other and mirror each other and are also different from each other in all kinds of interesting ways. We're really excited about the volume, as you can probably tell from my voice. So it's coming out with Manchester University Press. They've been fantastic in shepherding it through to production. And it's divided into 4 sections, which we've also framed around this through line of encounter. So we've got textual encounters, internal encounters, encountering the world, and performative encounters. So we start with textual encounters. We've got Diane Watt talking about the book and its antecedents. So she's placing Margery Kempe in the middle of a tradition of medieval women's writing, rather than seeing Margery at the beginning or the end of something. Putting Margery in the middle is a really fascinating idea. We've got Jo Coster, who is reassessing the prayers as an integral part of Margery's book. They come at the end. Sometimes people forget a little bit about them. But she thinks about them in relation to Middle English prayers more broadly and how they fit into the book as a whole. That intertextuality is also explored in Liz McAvoy and Naoi Kokita Yoshikawa's essay on the intertextual dialogue with Mechthild of Hackerborn's Book of Ghostly Grace, which I think is opening up all sorts of exciting new comparisons and dialogues between Margery's book and European material. Then we move on to internal encounters. We have 2 essays there from Johannes Wolff and Ruth Evans, who are reframing and exploring the debate around autobiography and voice in the book of Margery Kempe in all sorts of fascinating theoretical ways. Catherine Lewis is doing a similar kind of exploration through using an oral history methodology and thinking about confession and the ways in which Margery Kempe is constantly narrating and talking about her life and talking it over. My essay's in that section, and it's on exemplarity, thinking about the ways in which Margery offers herself as an exemplary figure whom we might imitate, particularly focusing on the idea of the book as a book of her feelings and how emotional imitation and engagement might be one of those ways of creating supportive female networks, in particular in the book. Then we move on to encountering the world. We start off in King's Lynn with some incredible new archival material from Susan Maddock, telling us all sorts of new and wonderful things about Margery's life in King's Lynn, Bishop's Lynn as it was then. Then we move to Europe. Anthony Bale and Daniela Giasu have identified Margaret Florentine in the book. And there, again, new archival research places Margery Kempe in a really fascinating, not just European context, but a Renaissance and early modern context. So Margery Kempe, Renaissance woman. Dorothy Kim takes us to the racialized soundscape of Jerusalem from the perspective of a global Middle Ages approach, which I think is an incredibly valuable and important way of thinking about sound and race and these key questions of how the book fits in more broadly outside of a purely English context. And Laura's essay is also in this section, reassessing Book 2 from an eco-critical point of view and really reframing the ways in which Book 2 is different from the rest of the book and thinking about why that might be and what might be going on there. And I don't think enough has been done thinking about Book 2, so that's a really important movement forward in Margery's scholarship. Finally, we end with 2 chapters in the performative encounters section. Sarah Sarley, who puts Margery Kempe into conversation with the modern performance artist Marina Abramovich to think about Margery's book as a performance archive and how both Margery and Marina are writing about performed lives. And then we've got Tara Williams, who re-examines the famous meeting between Marge and Jules, Margery Kempe and Julian of Norwich, in the context of modern play adaptations. So those wonderful Margery and Julian plays, one of which, by the Quaint Ladies, was performed at our Margery Kempe conference 3 years ago. So we've got an absolutely incredible set of essays in the volume. We're thrilled to bits with all the contributors. There is groundbreaking new research in there from the archives. There's incredibly brilliant and innovative new theoretical approaches. And we really hope that the volume is setting up Margery and her book for new directions in the 21st century. And we hope it will open up the conversation for other Margery scholars to come along and advance the field even further. So we're super excited.
I don't know how anyone could hear that table of contents and not be excited. It sounds like an amazing volume. And I think you can tell from the list you've just given why this podcast is going to have so many people talking about the same mystic. Everyone interprets these works differently. Everyone likes these mystics for different reasons and gets different things out of their texts. And we all just approach them so differently. That is one of the things that means they can be studied in all of these different and amazing ways. And speaking of why we all individually love these texts, we are reaching the end of the podcast, and now I need to ask you both, as two people who have dedicated so much of your careers to her, why is Margery still your favorite mystic?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? I think the answer is toe fondling. No. I've spent a lot of my life with Margery Kempe, actually, which might sound slightly strange, but I wrote my PhD on Margery, and I returned to her a little bit later in life because I did my MA and my BA in my early 20s, and then I had a big gap from academia, and I was a school teacher for many years and came back to do a part-time PhD once I'd had children and so on. And so there was something about the book that resonated with me as a young mother, I suppose, and somebody who was also setting out on a slightly different life trajectory. And so that, I think, was quite instrumental in what happened with my relationship with Margery. But, writing a PhD on her, which was never supposed to be a PhD entirely on Margery, actually. It was supposed to be a PhD about several visionary women, Julian, Bridget, Catherine, Sienna. But Margery just took over. She just dominated, as one might expect. And so I just let her do her thing, and it turned into a whole dissertation. And so it was sort of 10 years between me starting that research for the PhD and then my own book coming out about Margery Kempe. And still I'm working on Margery. And I think perhaps it's also got something to do with what Laura was saying earlier, which was that no matter how long you work on this text, you always find something else in it that is surprising and something that you hadn't perhaps noticed before. Or if you had noticed it, you hadn't thought about it in the same way before. And I just think that opens up so many other opportunities for deeper thinking. And also, as Laura mentioned too, we're beginning to understand so many more resonances and connections between Margery's book and the sort of European continental tradition of devotion in both directions, but particularly the influence of those continental religious women on Margery. And I think in terms of that happening and those sorts of avenues of research expanding, it takes Margery's book out of its original comfort zone, if you like, and it enables us to think about it in a much wider, broader sense. And I think that's a really exciting direction in Kempe studies and something that I'm really hoping will continue to sort of escalate. So I think there's always room for more. There's always something else that we can do, even if it's in terms of these sort of bigger conversations about European spirituality and so on. So yes, I think I've spent a long time with Margery so far, so I'd be a little bit sorry if she left me right now.
I completely agree. I think once you become attached to Margery, you can't shake her off, and nor would you want to. She's someone that I first encountered on my master's course, but she was a part of my PhD, although I did remove her from my monograph on the Church of Sacred Space. So in some ways, this is an act of penance for having done that. And now working on her separately but relatedly, and I've come back to my material on Margery in the Church a number of times. I think that, as Laura says, it's an incredibly rich text. There's so much to explore. Most of the recent work I've done on Margery has ended up being, I focus on one chapter or one moment in a chapter, and it becomes a 20,000 word article before I know what I'm doing. So every single chapter in itself is incredibly rich. And I do think that the book is in some ways a kind of encyclopedic gathering of devotional experience and practice and individuals and geography and experiences. And, you tease out one thread and you suddenly find all of these other things that are going on in the book. So you can read the whole book through one chapter or through one moment. And the ways in which it's so open to theoretical engagements, to resonances with the students that we're teaching, with what's going on in the world. And I do think that working on Margery Kempe is fundamentally a collaborative experience. Laura and I have dedicated our volume to our sisters in kin, friendship and alliance. And I think that, that's something that's really come out of our own relationship and collaboration on Margery, and continuing to bounce ideas off each other and talk about her. Margery Kempe is a mystic who brings people together, particularly women. I think she really speaks to us so strongly today, and so many of us, whatever our life situation and personal situation, I think can draw strength and courage from Margery's book. The hashtag She Persisted got attached to Margery at one point. We've got our Team Margery hashtag. Margery Kempe is this example of a powerful woman speaking out, shaping her own life experience in the way that she wants to, having that voice, which is so important for all of us in academia and in the world at the moment. So, there's absolutely no reason not to carry on working on Margery Kempe. She's the best.
Well, there you have it. If you decide that now is the time to dedicate your life to Margery Kempe, you will find yourself in some excellent company. Please check out Encountering the Book of Margery Kempe, out from Manchester University Press this month. You will find a link to that in the show notes. And Laura Varnam, Laura Kalas, the Margery Kempe Lauras, thank you for joining me today and sharing your love of Margery Kempe and telling us all about this fascinating new volume.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having us. It's been fantastic. Yeah, thanks a lot.
And thank you all so much for listening. You can find a link to Encountering the Book of Margery Kempe in our show notes, as well as a link to our Twitter. Please give us a follow and share the podcast if you're enjoying it. But most importantly, join me next time when I speak to Joseph Lombard about Ahmed al-Ghazali.